John, what surprises me is some of the biggest pushback I get against critical race theory comes from other Asian Americans, other Koreans, and some even in my own church. It's interesting because if anyone should be able to understand this, it would be a group that has been subjugated.
Finally.
It's about time.
I got Dr. Alex Jun here.
Yeah.
I'm so happy. I said this to you already, but I know this sounds cheesy, but I wish I could spend more time with you. Man, the first time I met you was at that West Coast pre-Asian conference for Gospel Coalition.
That's right.
And you were one of that breakout session speakers. And you walk up, you got these crazy cowboy shoes on. And I was like, who is this guy? Who is this guy? But as you were talking, I was like, this guy's reading my mind right now. This is amazing.
Oh, what?
How is he reading my
funny.
mind? Everything you're saying, I was like, who is it? I need to get to know this guy right now. I need to get to know this guy. And I don't know if you remember when you said this one line about, are we going to have a pre-conference for white Americans before Gospel Club? I was like, oh, that hit me right here.
I don't remember saying that, but that sounds like something I would say for sure. Yeah,
I was in the third row and I wanted to stand up
Yeah.
and just clap. I was like, this guy's reading my mind.
I mean, you got to flip the script, right?
Dude,
This is exactly what it is.
What you were saying there was just so raw, so real. And so I'm thankful that we got to spend some more time afterwards and we got some lunch. And so thanks for being here. Thanks for being here.
It's an honor to be here. I'm so sorry we couldn't have this earlier. My mom was in a car accident and all that. And so she's doing a lot better now. Thank God. But man, I'm just so glad to be here. And
She's
I appreciate
still with
all
you guys?
you're doing.
She's
living with us now.
So
I think this is our new normal. Yeah, which is not a problem at all.
Mhm.
Kids love having high money.
Yeah.
My wife is a saint. It's been great. Yeah. So very thankful. So thanks for the invitation. Great to be here.
My Trojan brother, we're both Trojans. Fight on. Yeah. What year did you graduate?
Well, we're going to go there already.
Yeah.
1991.
Okay. And what did you study there?
I studied psychology and political science.
And then from there,
there,
did you go to seminary? What did you do after that?
So I went right from, I was KCM president. KCM president, a long history of it. In fact, KCM started my sophomore year of college, and I had just become a Christian like a semester before that. And so formative years for me. And then 3 years later as a senior, I was KCM president. And then I finished and, I had met my wife. She wasn't my wife at the time, but she'd asked me at the time because every KCM president went on to become a pastor. They either went to Talbot or they went to Westminster, but they went to seminary. And Jeannie asked me, Opa, are you going to seminary? And I said, no, why would I do that? And it was remarkable for her because she thought, I just assumed you would go to seminary. And I said, no, I've never had a desire for seminary, never even. So it's definitely a calling. Knew I wanted to serve the Lord some way, shape, or form, but never seminary. And that's still true. So I've never been to seminary.
You said you grew up in Virginia. So in Virginia, you were not going to church, or
No,
you were?
I was born in Virginia,
Okay.
Alexandria, Virginia.
Yeah.
That's how I got my name, Alexander. My sister's name, middle name, consequently, is Virginia. We lived there for about 5-6 years, and then we moved to San Francisco, the Bay Area. So I grew up in Burlingame, Millbrae, and San Mateo. Went to Aragon High School, graduated in 1987, then went to USC.
But no church during that time, even with your parents.
Nope. I mean, briefly, my parents my father who felt pressured by his mother to take us to church. We went to some Methodist church. It was one of those hating it churches where everything was in Korean, and anyone who spoke English, you could be 5 years old or you can be 35. And they were all together in one room. Well, I think we all know that story. And that's what life was like for me in junior high school and high school, briefly attending churches. But if we have time, there's a whole story of a friend of mine, Doug Andrews. His mom, Verda, owned a Baskin Robbins. To be honest, the business wasn't very good. But so we sat there and talked all the time. This is Doug and me. And he shared the gospel with me. And all the time we argued, we talked about all these things. And I didn't come to saving faith until freshman year in college. And so back then we didn't have internet. So I was trying to find this guy because he was the first one I wanted to tell, hey, I became a Christian. I know you've been praying for me. I finally became a Christian. And it took years later for me to finally connect with him. But guess what he ended up doing? He became a pastor, a youth pastor at the church where he attended, where he invited me to youth group all the time. So, man, I wanted to go back to the youth group there and say, hey, you're a pastor. When he tells you to share the gospel with your classmates, and you're going to take a lot of abuse and a lot of criticism, but it's going to be worth it because you don't know what kind of seed you're planting. How do I know? Because I was that guy. I was the guy who gave him a hard time, but he shared the gospel and shared his faith with me regularly. And man, anyway, sorry. We're going to go off on a lot of tangents.
No.
Thought I'd share that story with you.
That's a great story. Great story. Now, when you became a Christian at SC, what church did you start going to? So
I became a Christian through Navigators. One of those Bridge to Life, pamphlets. As soon as I became a Christian, I come outside and I have my RA at Mark's Tower, and he's Korean American. So I said, hey, Hyung, I became a Christian. He goes, oh, that's great. I said, well, I should go to church. And he says, yeah, come to my church. I didn't know he went to church, but anyway, he said, come to my church. Full gospel in LA.
Yeah.
On First in Vermont, back in the day, right in the heart of K-Town. And that was my church and my formative years for the first 6 years of my Christian life, all the way through college and a couple of years afterwards. And I was there until New Life Mission Church planted in 1993. So after that, I've been at that church ever since. So 2 churches.
When you first became a Christian and you were at SC, wasn't that during the time where KCM was slowly becoming more English speaking because it was mostly Korean speaking?
That's right.
But in the early 90s, late 80s, was it already more English speaking by the time you got there? Or was it still like a transition period?
It was right in the middle of both English and Korean. So we'd have guest speakers coming and speaking. We'd have praise bands doing songs in English and Korean. And these are all young people, right? We didn't have a KM, like the 40-year-olds coming in. It was all young people who were divided. So a lot of my friends in college were pretty fobby. They came when they were young, 1.5ers, but they spoke Korean and English. We'd start one sentence and finish the other in 2 languages. Never completing a sentence in one language, that's a problem. But that was fairly typical. My church too, we called it English ministry, but the college group was like half English, half Korean. And so that's where my Korean probably got a lot better because I didn't have any context. My first church experience was a Korean experience. Listening to prayers and scripture and sermons, and sharing my faith all in Korean. That transition happened by the time I was a senior in 1991. Everyone was pretty much English speaking. And naturally, you saw these Korean international students groups starting to form. So I think it was a natural divide.
Was Pastor Jimmy one of your guest speakers or campus staff people?
Oh, yeah. Jimmy was deeply involved in KCM. We went to chapel. I know he was on the show. I loved listening to your interview with him. But it was funny because I remember, I don't know if Jimmy would remember this, but his first message at KCM Chapel, and I was there, and he said, I told everyone I'm going to seminary. And they said, oh yeah, Shinhakyo. And he goes, no, not shoe school. I'm going to seminary. And I'm like, man, that is some funny stuff. That was funny. I don't know if he was joking or what, but with Jimmy, you just never know.
Yeah, right.
No, I didn't go to shoe school. I went to seminary.
Well, that's a wild story. So I didn't know that. I didn't know you got saved in college in KCM. I thought you grew up in the church your whole life. So when you were going to full gospel, did you experience tension with the Korean speaking first gen, like most of us did when we were growing up? Or were you already in a stage of life where you're already an adult, so it didn't really bother you?
No. Those were, again, formative years for me, both in terms of my spiritual growth and also in my ethnic identity. So it was an interesting challenge to be in such a strong Korean culture. They were great to me. But to be honest, I think in those early days for English-speaking ministries, they weren't fully independent, nor could they recognize that they could have full independence at the time. And so I feel like there was this generational difference of people who were so much more embracing of English speaking because they literally were the children of the KM. And the EM were much more gracious. But I think there was more of a silent exodus where they said, I'm going to go find a church that fits me. And, they were non-Korean churches. I know Helen Lee had written about that in the mid-90s, about the silent exodus. But no, at the time, it was really a very, memory does a funny thing, right? We remember things fondly, maybe more fondly than we should. We block out some of the trauma. But I had nothing but fond memories.
What was the reason why you left Full Gospel and went to New Life?
2 reasons. One was missions. KCM was very big on missions, obviously, and my first short-term mission trip to then Soviet Union, USSR in 1991, and went with a team with one young lady who would later become my wife. And so all of the Chandoshas who were involved in KCM started a church because they realized we can't just have parachurch ministries. We want to be mission-focused, we want to be team-oriented, and we want to be reformed. And at the time, going to a Pentecostal church, I didn't exactly know what that was, but what they were preaching was very biblical for me. And so it was a natural connection. And the early days, Pastor Samuel Park, Joshua Lee, James Lee, these were the founders of New Life Mission Church back in 1993, and they were all very involved in KCM. So it was a critical, pivotal moment in my spiritual life where they said, we're starting a church. And we want folks that we did ministry with in college to come start this church. I mean, what did I know? So yeah, that was the start of it, 1993. Part of that, I wouldn't even consider myself a member of a church plant. I didn't even know what that was. But yeah, 30-something years later, and the church is still there. We're celebrating 1993. So we're celebrating our 30th anniversary this June.
That's some deep
really
history
exciting.
right there. Deep history. Were you there when Lloyd was there too?
Oh yeah.
Before Will.
Yeah.
Okay. So you were there from the beginning. Actually, you just said that. Yeah. So you were there with the founders to Lloyd to Will.
Yeah. Lloyd Kim will just jam me up on this story, but he was graduating Berkeley and then working for one of the big 5 accounting firms before he went to seminary. But there was a conversation someone had with me. They said, hey, there's this guy coming down from Berkeley looking for a roommate. I had lived by myself. And he said, you would love this guy. He's clean. He runs at 5 a.m. You're never going to see him. And I heard that and I'm like, that does not sound very appealing. So I said, no, I don't want to live with that guy. Turned out it was Lloyd Kim, which is a funny story.
Oh, so you guys were roommates?
Yeah, we almost were roommates.
Oh, okay.
I didn't want to live with him.
Okay.
Sorry, Lloyd.
Okay, you got to tell me about this because there's such a funny history that you have. You went to missions for 2 years, right? In Cambodia?
Cambodia, we were there from 2010 to 2013.
And were you married already to Jeannie?
Yeah, married,
okay.
3 kids.
With your kids?
Our kids were 4, 6, and 8.
Okay, so how did you make that decision and what compelled you guys both to do that?
Well, I'm trying not to give too much of a patent Christian answer, but it was the Lord, absolutely. I was at USC. I was working. If you're Korean American, this is the perfect job. Right? Parents would be so proud to say you're a faculty member at USC. I was running a master's program. Life was good, and it was the Holy Spirit just whispering to me through Lloyd, because we had sent them off. He was our pastor, and we sent them off to missions to first the Philippines, and they served there for several years before relocating to Cambodia. And we had prayed about, my family, Jeannie and I had prayed about doing missions a little longer term, and prayed and prayed and prayed. But most of our life looked like we were just preparing to stay. We just bought a house and we had jobs and all these things, and it was wonderful. But when Lloyd said, hey, would you still consider coming out to Cambodia? And we just need Christians living out here as witnesses. You don't need to be a pastor. We just need, I guess the term would be incarnational ministry. Show folks what it looks like to live as Christians wherever you are. And just in that soft, gentle way that he approached me, it struck a chord. And I said, that makes sense. I think serving the Lord is going to be more important than being a faculty member at USC. Serving the Lord is going to be more important than whatever career decisions I think are most important for me personally. So it made the decision somewhat easier. There was an opportunity at Azusa Pacific University. This is in 2007, 2008. They started a PhD program, and I was invited to apply. And it's a Christian institution, obviously. And I said, this must be the Lord. So I left USC to take a position at APU, and I've been there ever since. So I'm going into my 15th year now at APU. And so by God's mercy, I was able to go while I was working at APU as a faculty member and was able to go and do research. I do what I do as a PhD faculty member, conducting research and writing and all that. But a good chunk of my time was all about serving as, we were seconded to M.Div, Mission to the World. But yeah, we were there as missionaries from 2010 to 2013.
What kind of ministry were you and Jeannie doing there?
A lot of the work was typically what I would do here. Working with the local church, I led praise. I had to learn Khmer. That was a mess trying to sing songs in Khmer. It reminded me of the days when I was singing songs in Korean and leading praise. Fond memories. But trying to work with the local college students, doing discipleship, Bible studies. Yeah, just everyday typical life of a layperson at a church, just happened to be in Cambodia instead of the United States.
For a Korean to own a house, working at SC, I didn't even know that. Were you in the philosophy department? What department?
I was in the Rossier School of Education. I was running a master's program.
Okay. So running a master's program for Korean culture, it's like, dude, you kind of made it. Don't give that up.
I know, right? Yeah.
How did you and then, another thing is having 3 kids.
Yeah.
So for people who are afraid to make those sacrifices, for me, the kids would be a big thing. It's like, man, I don't know if I could go on missions because of my kids. For people who are afraid, but they're really trying to think about missions, but they're afraid of all of those things, what would you tell them? How do you make that sacrifice?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think every stage of life is an opportunity for us to recognize our idolatries. Some people will say, well, I want to start my career first. Isn't that important? And we'll justify, of course that's important. But that becomes a reason why we say we can't go yet. Let me go to med school first. Let me go to law school first. And I hear those testimonies all the time because it's going to be for the greater glory, et cetera. But let's be honest. Are those the real reasons why we don't go? And then you get married and then it's not good. Then you buy your first house and then it's not a good time. You have children, it's not a good time. I would say when the Lord calls you to go, that's the right time to go. And you can make it work. Now my children are all older. They all drive and live their own lives. It's actually a lot easier to have them when you can put them in a car seat and they have no choice. They have to travel with you. In that sense, ministry is hard, but it's easier. Now they live their own lives. I can't have dinner with my family. We have to schedule out, 2-3 weeks in advance. It's interesting because then people say, well, I'll do it when I retire. And Lord willing, when I'm done with, my work as a faculty member, we'd love to go back on the field full time. So that's a prayer request for those who are watching and listening. But again, you won't have your children with you, but then you're just old. Your body doesn't work well in the heat or in the cold.
There's no good amount of hanyak that can help at that point.
There's something beautiful about going at that age. Some of the retired folks serving the Lord in their 60s and 70s, but that's hard too. So there's never a right time to serve the Lord on missions if you have a million reasons why. And it's always the right time to serve the Lord on missions if we can be obedient and responsive to the Holy Spirit.
Did Jeannie have any reservations, to go for 2 years? We got 3 kids. Was she worried at all?
No. I mean, she had lots of logistical questions, but there wasn't a doubt in her mind. In fact, because her father had passed away when we were planning on a visit before she went. And Jeannie is one of those rare people who said, okay, let's go. And her first time in Cambodia was when we moved there. She did not do any planning in advance, didn't visit. And to be honest, she would say, would it have made a difference? Like if I went for 6 weeks and saw what it was like, and then would I come back and say, no, we're not going? If we say we're going, then we're going. I mean, she's just built differently. But we met on short-term mission. We had always prayed about going together. And so having gone to Cambodia for 3 years was great. We came back and now we're praying about going again. So Lord willing, when the time is right. But if the opportunities were there now, I think we'd do it. I think we'd go now.
The faith and trust that she had while not even visiting, that is a rare find. I can't believe that she moved there literally first time and said, we're just going to do it.
Yeah.
That takes such an incredible amount of faith and trust. And it's such a blessing.
I'd love to lift up my wife in these opportunities, but I think she was just an ordinary person. It was all God. God moves in hearts in ways that we can't imagine. And this is a good example. But all the credit and glory goes to God.
So tell me, you got this 2-year history, Cambodia, teaching APU, but tell me this question, answer this question for me. How on earth did you become an extra on Korean dramas? I saw that clip last month. How did that happen? I don't even understand where that came from.
Yeah, well, the story goes back to Jeannie and her family. Her i모부 was a director in Korea for MBC back in the day before they immigrated to the United States. And so he has a long history of being a producer, and he had lots of younger folks, hubes in the industry. And so this is 1994. And 천원일기 was a very popular show in Korea at the time. And one of the episodes they had was 한국분 미국 사람. They wanted to do a piece on Korean Americans and fairly stereotypical role of loud, obnoxious Korean Americans who don't know anything about the culture, don't know anything about the language, and they needed to learn from salt of the earth people, the good folks on 천원일기 who would teach these wild Korean Americans. So anyway, that was the premise of the show. And one of his hubes had asked Jeannie's i모부, would you have any actors who would go, who can pretend to not speak Korean and pretend to be loud and obnoxious? And so he asked Jeannie and her boyfriend at the time, that was me, if we would do it. And, we were talking before we started recording about church skits and like all these things. We did plenty of those. So like, what's your resume? What's your acting resume? I'm like, let's see. There was that
Youth Winter Retreat.
Then there was the summer retreat. We won first place. So yeah, how different can it be?
Yeah.
So based on that, we were able to go to Korea, and we were featured as the primary actors of this one episode. 한국분 미국 사람. Yeah, that was a lot of fun.
When you did that, did you ever think for a second like, I ever want to pursue acting? Did that thought come into your mind?
No.
What about Jeannie? Not her either?
It's a funny story with Jeannie. I had discovered these videos only later. She's a bit of a K-Town famous because when she was a little girl, another one of her uncles did commercials. So he did commercials for what is it? 이병일 Piano and 김수정기 and all these other things. And she was the little girl on a lot of the voiceovers and, acting in these commercials. So it's so funny. But I don't think she had any desire to become an actress.
When we first met, I asked you this one question, and I think it's a pretty good question for everyone to know the answer to. You're at New Life, and I told this to Will too. Growing up in college, we all knew about New Life Church. It was always that ultra Reformed church. That's how we knew it. Like, oh yeah, New Life, the Reformed church, right? And I asked you this question. You're an elder. You're the head elder at New Life Presbyterian Church.
We don't have any head elders. No, I'm one of.
Okay. I thought Will said you were the head elder, or maybe doesn't it say on the website? I think it says that.
I think that was Harold Kim.
Okay.
I generally don't listen to anything Harold says.
Okay, maybe I made that up, but I thought
Sorry,
I saw
Harold.
that. Okay, so you're one of the elders at this ultra Reformed church, but you're a professor at APU, which is, I don't consider to be Reformed at all. And we even talked about some other stuff that you guys are doing and like your statement of faith. Like to the outside world, APU feels a little bit more loose on some things than maybe a strict Christian college would be like. How is that balance like for you? How do you hold on to this ultra reformed theology, teaching at APU? You write books that, again, not a common topic that Koreans talk about, but you have this experience and knowledge and research about a lot about race and ethnicity and stuff like that. So how do you balance your theological convictions with Reformed theology, but you're in like this APU world?
One of the challenges, I think, is our assumptions about like what Reformed theology actually does to a person. And we, by and large, have only seen the negative effects of hyper-Calvinists. And for a while, if I confess, I was like this, our church was like this, the culture was, I will out-reform you, right? If you say anything that remotely does not sound reform, we will call it out and beat it out of you. Because that's what we prided ourselves on, which is really shameful if I think about it, because in true Reformed faith, it should come as a natural byproduct, loving, caring, generous. I don't think we Reformed people are known to be those things. Those are not the attributes that are associated with Reformed Presbyterians. And that's really, really unfortunate. Going to APU, which is, they are much more Wesleyan in their tradition. It's a Wesleyan holiness tradition, fully egalitarian in their approach, but still very much Christian. And I think going from a USC, where if you met a Methodist or you met anyone who's remotely Christian, right? Hey, brother, hey, sister, we're the same faith. There's something beautiful. Then I get to APU, folks who really know the theological distinctions in the faith traditions. And I say, oh yeah, I'm Presbyterian. Are you URC, PCUSA, PCA? And they'd know, I'm like, I don't know. I didn't know there were so many distinctions. Something beautiful happens for me when I'm in a space where everyone identifies as Christian. Rather than digging in and trying to show how I'm more reformed or more biblical, and the temptation may always be there, something beautiful could happen where we see that we have more in common than we have in difference. And that's the part that I think we really need to embrace. And so going to APU has been so helpful for me in that sense, in recognizing the unity that we have in Christ. And if we want to get down theological distinctions and our differences of faith traditions, we can certainly have those discussions. But we realize most of those discussions that we have amongst brothers and sisters only ends up being divisive. But I still hold to all the Westminster divines, and I'm very much a Reformed elder in my church, and I hold to all the standards that we have. Still a member in good standing in my denomination. But it's interesting because you're asking about things that I write on. You could be a Reformed Presbyterian elder and still care about justice, racial justice, social justice. Those two should not be in opposition to each other. But it maybe says something about some of my tradition, where most of the folks who are very proud and bold about sharing their Reformed faith, and they carry it as a badge, are also the most vocal against social justice. And I wish that wasn't so. I'd like to think, and I'd like to see more folks who hold to a Reformed perspective who are also at the same time very much passionate about social justice issues. And your social justice issues should come as a byproduct of your theological convictions, not in opposition to your theological convictions. So I'd like to think that I'm just being consistent with what I believe as a Reformed Presbyterian.
I think what you described there, especially with the social justice, racial justice, those are two topics that I think most of us, when we grew up, I didn't even know what those words meant. I've never even heard of that, to be honest, like probably not even till post-college, like what's social justice? What is that? Never even heard of that before. A lot of that's probably from our parents. They're immigrants. They're absolutely don't know what that is. They don't talk like that, right? But I think this is a byproduct of what I see, which is I feel like as Koreans, we were always exclusive, not sometimes in bad ways, but also in a sense of like we were like really protected from, like our parents didn't even want us to think about certain things because they just wanted to protect us. So we were very bound, which created this exclusive kind of lifestyle for Korean Americans, especially.
That's right.
And as we were growing up,
Yeah.
that's why we never talked about politics. We just knew abortion was bad,
Mhm.
but we never researched it or anything like that.
Yeah.
But some of that, I think, again, when it gets to theology,
Yeah.
that's where, again, that style of exclusivity comes in. When I was in seminary, I was listening to J-Mac and I loved him and
Yeah.
I was so bound theologically. I was like that. Like,
Yeah.
get out of here. I don't want to associate with you, So it's like this byproduct where
Absolutely right. Yeah.
we just, some of it is we didn't experience it. But I do feel like part of it also is bad too. Like you said, like we almost don't want to associate ourselves with different theological viewpoints or even social viewpoints. And I think being at Saddleback, it was like one of the first times where I got to experience what you just said. Like there needs to be more unity. But it's really hard for me still because this is how I grew up. There's like this side of me that feels very uncomfortable still with different, even secondary theological viewpoints. And like, it's a challenge for me. Like I'm learning it currently still right now.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you're right. You think about the very relatively short immigration history of Koreans in America, right? We don't have as long a history of immigration as some of our other Asian counterparts. But you think about the ideology or the theology of why, I don't want to overly stereotype here, but why a lot of Koreans came to the United States. It was for economic benefits, right? Buying into the whole myth of the American dream, primarily about education, which would lead to economic advantage. And so that was the primary focus. And church was a benefit on top of that. I can think of how many people was saying, well, yeah, I want you to believe 적당히, don't overdo it. Like, don't believe so much that you become a pastor or a missionary. Why can't you just be a good, faithful doctor or a good, faithful lawyer? And I love talking to young folks about this conversation because it's been going on for a long time. That's also a bit of a theological edge to it. And, stay the mainstream, be as American as you can. Well, when we say be as American as we can, we mean be as white as you can. Because when folks immigrated, by and large in the United States in the 70s, we saw what was going on in the 60s and 70s in terms of civil rights. I always wonder, what was it about immigrants who came to the United States who saw the battle of civil rights, black, brown, and white, and they said, okay, these are the Americans, we got to be like them. They weren't talking about the black and brown citizens who were fighting for rights, who actually were fighting to help other immigrants benefit as well. We were talking about white folks. And so that sort of white adjacency, wanting to become more American, was a big part of a lot of us growing up. So that's where it gets really complicated. And John, I was the same way, right? When people brought up diversity, I said, oh, that's not biblical. And anyone who talks about Martin Luther King, he wasn't a Christian. His theological views were horrible. And the only ones that I would support were all Western European dead white men, right? Because that was the standard of excellence. I also bought into it. Seminaries continue to teach in these ways. And it's not very critical in our approach. And I think we're byproducts of that, that I'm still trying to deconstruct that, trying to work through some of the assumptions that I heard growing up that I probably still believe that I'm trying to work through.
How would you advise, like what kind of wisdom would you offer for Korean Americans because I think most of us grew up like that. And I think, again, still till this day, it's like we're very bounded. Like if you're Reformed, you're going to stay with these guys. If you're not, you're going to stay with these guys. Miraculous gifts, it makes us uncomfortable, so we don't want to associate. How would you advise Korean Americans to be more diverse and unified? But you got to admit, there is a little bit of fear there too, because there's some wacky theology out there, and we want to kind of protect them in a sense so that they don't get kind of pulled into some of the heretical things, I'm not talking about secondary things.
Yeah.
More of the heretical things. Like, this is some extreme movements of the miraculous stuff, or now it's getting very dangerous. So how can we do that without losing them to some bad, blurry theology?
Yeah. What an interesting question. I think I have to challenge the premise of the very question you're asking, because I look at my own faith tradition, and which is Presbyterian Reformed in the United States. And if I'm completely honest, we were on the wrong side of history when it came to civil rights and slavery. And in fact, there are still people who hold quote unquote good theology who would still say that slavery had benefits for enslaved Africans. And that's some warped theology. That's heretical at best. But to say that we possess the true faith and knowledge and theological traditions, and we need to be careful of other heresies like critical race theory, for example, right? What about the heresy of white supremacy that has been embedded in the church in America? How is that not a heresy? Christian nationalism. And not just parts of my denomination, but Southern Baptists and other non-denominational groups, right? So that's the challenge of the question that you're asking. We're presupposing that the existing denominations that have been on the wrong side of some of these social justice issues have always been theologically accurate. I want to say that very carefully, because it sounds like I'm being critical and rejecting my own faith tradition. I'm not. But I want to be able to say, can I recognize with a critical lens some of the people keep using the word blind spots, but just a theologically wrong on certain positions. Then what makes us theologically accurate? And then who are we to judge other denominations to say that they are theologically wrong and they're going down the path of heresy? There may be a time and place to have that conversation, but I think I want to start with tending my own vineyard. We look into the world. I say this a lot as an educator. We look into the world and look upon others through this window that we gaze upon others. And it turns out it was never a window. It was always a mirror. So we need to look at ourselves. We need to do a self-analysis and a reflection of our own long-held assumptions that we thought were correct. And we come to realize we weren't. Then what do we do with it? We should wrestle with these things. And I think that's healthy. It's a good spiritual practice for us.
We're getting into it right now. So let's just kind of jump the gun here with one of the things I wanted to talk to you about.
Oh, we're going to talk about CRT?
This is going to get heavy. CRT has become a very, very huge topic in these past couple of years, especially with what we have experienced in our country these past couple of years. A lot of sad things, a lot of tragic things, and books are being written about it and all these things. Woke is a new term, all this stuff. Tell me about CRT a little bit, because for me, there's parts of CRT that I understand and I get. But then one of the biggest things that I have, it's hard for me to be compatible with it, is this idea that everyone is oppressed. Everyone, all of the minorities were oppressed. So we have to tell them that they have been oppressed from the beginning in the school system, things like that. We have to tell them that white supremacy is keeping them down. And is that position inaccurate? Because that's what I feel like CRT is pushing, especially what they're trying to do in education. So teach me a little bit more about it, because that's the way I see CRT. There's some good things about it. I think we should talk about white supremacy. Yeah. It is an issue. We should talk about racial justice. It still exists today. My thing is it sounds like you're saying everyone's a racist and we have to tell people that all white people are racist. That's what I feel like is happening. Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate the conversation. And John, I'll just say personally, I've always appreciated your willingness to listen and learn. I never feel like you are asking questions to try to get a gotcha moment out of somebody. And too many times I've had these conversations with folks and they're not actually wanting to listen. And I think the way even that you framed it comes from a certain perspective, right? If we say that being overly reductive, right, and saying CRT means we hate white people, right? And that's not true. That is not what critical race theory was originally intended. And we can disagree, but it really has always been about power. And so when you have power and dominance, and you have any group that is in power, usually wants to maintain power, wants to maintain control, and maintain dominance. Now, some might say, well, how do you reconcile that as a Christian? For me, I'm a Calvinist, so it's the T in total depravity, right? That is human nature, this side of glory. That will always be the case, that human nature is corrupt and broken because of the fall. And so any system that we create will be flawed and broken. And so it really does ultimately become about power. Now, it's power and privilege that comes with that power and your inability to recognize it when you're in those positions of power. And if we would apply that to race, then we look at what group, because the context of critical race theory and critical legal studies in the 60s and 70s was about race. But can it be applied to other areas, right? Gender, orientation, economics, it certainly could, but critical race theory talked about race. And so the folks who were in dominant positions were white folks, right? And so it's hard not to talk about race when you're talking about critical race theory, hard not to talk about race and power. So I think that's an important distinction. What I find interesting is, now I'll get pushback from some white brothers and sisters about critical race theory. That doesn't necessarily surprise me. John, what surprises me is some of the biggest pushback I get against critical race theory comes from other Asian Americans, other Koreans, and some even in my own church. It's interesting because if anyone should be able to understand this, it would be a group that has been subjugated, right? If I were to take critical race theory as an example and apply it to, say, South Korea, right? You look at South Korea has been arguing with Japan, because they had colonized and invaded Korea, took our halmonis and made them comfort women, and all these atrocities that happened because they looked down on Koreans as an inferior race. And the history books continue to tell a story in Japan of what happened during that period in the early 1900s up to the end of the war. They tell a very different story, right? And so South Koreans are saying, hey, this is not true. You can't tell a story that makes it sound like Korea invited Japan in to save us. No, you invaded us. You raped our women. You pillaged our lands. You abused all of our men, conscripted them and put them to work. And, these types of things. And if you're in Japan and you're hearing this, you're going to say, I disagree. That's critical race theory. Don't talk about oppression and power. Don't make it all about race. You're saying every Korean suffered like this? No. And now you're trying to change history? You want to change our Japanese history books to tell your version of it? Right? No, don't do that. If I gave that argument for Koreans, I think a lot of them would say, I get it. That makes sense. But here in the United States, we can't contextualize it for some reason. So we buy into what comes naturally for us anyway, is to go with a dominant majority voice. And so I think that's part of the challenge. I think the other thing that you may bring up is, and I have a problem with this too, to some extent, critical race theory is a lens by which we look at and problematize American society. right? So we talk about power, we talk about racism. And one of the tenets of critical race theory is the permanence of racism, which again, it aligns with my theological convictions of total depravity, that somehow good Presbyterian Reformed folks would say, yes, amen, I believe in total depravity, but racism has ended. Well, if you believe in total depravity, then how could racism have ended? Because Jesus hasn't come back yet. We're still broken. We're still depraved. It's still a broken world with broken systems. So that's an interesting challenge that I would have for some of my theologically astute friends. The other point is, and the criticism that I've heard was, well, critical race theory only points out the problems and doesn't actually have solutions. Well, that may be true. But to simply reject then critical race theory because all it does is present problems, I have an issue with that. If someone is doing research on cancer and they say, it turns out smoking causes cancer, and certain other carcinogens will cause cancer, so you shouldn't eat certain things, consume it. And our response to that is, well, did you cure cancer? If you're not about making a cure and you're only talking about how the problems occur, well, then I'm going to reject your findings and say it's not helpful. Or some Christians who are too heavenly minded for any earthly good will say, if it's not about salvation, well, then why do we talk about it? Because if it's not ultimately about salvation, then it's not something Christians should concern themselves about. How come we don't apply that when it comes to abortion? How come we don't apply that when it comes to gun control? How come we don't apply that when it comes to baseball or any other kind of calling that Christians are involved in? So we're very selective in what we choose to say, this is an important issue and this is not. I would just say, can we at least be consistent in the way that we would approach critical race theory or we approach cancer research? People don't have a problem going to a physician if we're sick. We rarely ask the question of physicians, hey, were you trained at a Christian institution? Right? Or do you believe in the Big Bang and, evolution? If that's the way you were trained, I'm not sure you're a Christian. I don't know if you should be doing some of the things you're doing. Shouldn't we just use the Bible to answer all of our problems, to solve all of our problems? And at least some of these folks who refuse medical treatment, at least they're consistent. I would disagree with them that all truth is God's truth. God can use ordinary means to accomplish extraordinary things, both in medicine and science and in social science. So at least be consistent in the way that we approach this. But that's the biggest pushback I get, is when people say, your approach to critical race theory is a secular theory and it's not Christian. So we shouldn't apply it. We shouldn't even hear it. If that's true, be consistent with English literature, be consistent with science, be consistent with geography. If it's not rooted in a biblical approach, then why do you accept it? I should stop. But, the same thing with, do you recycle, John?
I try to, not the best. I
try. But rarely do you hear someone say, well, recycling is rooted in an environmentalist lobby that is fundamentally anti-Christian, so have nothing to do with it. Let's throw plastic out on the street, right, as a Christian response. Of course not. We might do it because of stewardship, because God's called us to take good care of and be good stewards of the land that we're living in. Maybe that's why we recycle. Our motivation might be different. But to simply say that recycling is ultimately rooted in an anti-Christian, non-Christian philosophy, and therefore we should reject it, then Christians maybe across the country, no one is recycling so they can be a good Christian witness. Makes no sense, right?
So much eisegesis happening. Eisegesis works best when it supports your own position and perspective.
Absolutely.
And that's why I think it's so dangerous. I think when you say you get the most pushback from Korean Americans, the first thing I thought of was that model minority myth. And I think that's what a lot of us grew up as. We assimilated to white American culture. I think our parents were forced to. they had nothing. You didn't know the language, but they had to. And we were raised in an American education system, and we thought this was the way to assimilate.
Yeah.
We were generally, typically, back in the 80s, 70s, and 80s, we were quiet. We just thought like that's who we are. And
That's right.
The white Americans were always the CEOs and leaders.
Yeah.
And we just thought like, well, I'm always going to work under these guys. So I think a lot of the minority myth is coming out. Some of the people recognize it. Some people don't even know that they are experiencing that.
That's
I
right.
Totally experienced that most of my life. And I think that's coming out. That's why there's pushback. They don't get it, stuff like that.
Now be careful there, John, because as you're saying that, it sounds like someone's telling you that you've been oppressed.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
That's exactly right. When we come to that recognition that these are the things that have been happening and we bought into it, we've internalized some of this stuff.
Yeah.
The model minority myth, let's be good Asians. And we knew what good Asian was versus bad Asian, right? And it was a system that was set up for us to pick a side and assimilate to the side that made us better. In the eyes of whom? In the eyes of the white majority.
Yeah.
Be careful. That sounds a lot like critical race theory.
Okay. So let's talk about white supremacy here, because how would you answer this? Because the risk is that we start teaching about it, but as a white American, it's good to learn about that because this is a real thing that happens. But what about the risk? Because the common thing is like, well, what if every white kid like feels guilty and feels bad? Like they never saw them way like that. And what if they truly never actually lived like that or experienced that? How would you respond to that?
Yeah. You're at Saddleback, so I appreciate this. Your senior pastor starts one of his famous books with, "It's not about you."
Yeah.
That's part of the problem, is we're so individualistic in our thinking that when we hear an argument about systems, we immediately internalize it.
Oh, so good.
And individualize it.
Yeah.
That's our eisegesis. This is the problem with scriptural interpretation. We think the Bible is about us. It's about God. So we're reading into scripture that was never intended for me personally in some of these stories. So the same thing is true because that's a white Western individualistic culture.
Mm.
And so when we talk about guilt, right, if that's what we end up with, and we say, "Are you happy, Alex? I feel guilty now." No, you fundamentally misunderstood and you've personalized this. That's why you feel guilty. Let me change the example. You and I both walked in here, right? It was normal into the studio. Neither of us looked for disability access, ramps, braille, anything like that. We didn't need assistance coming in, right? Some would argue this is a form of ability privilege. And I say this to you, and it applies to me because we're able-bodied right now. Do you feel guilty hearing that? Is my end goal in bringing up ability privilege to make you feel guilty and say, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe I have all this ability"? Okay, disabled friends, you win. I feel horrible. Of course not. But if we're in the privileged group with ability privilege and we hear that, rather than personalizing it, shouldn't we react a different way? Not reject it to say, "Well, look, I didn't choose to be able-bodied, right? Don't blame me." Or do we just reject the premise entirely? No, there should be another response. That's what I'd hope would happen. And it's true for men. It's true for able-bodied. It's true for anything where we possess a dominant group. We celebrate Christmas. We celebrate Easter. It's part of our faith tradition. South Coast Plaza was closed during Easter. I thought that was very interesting. Everybody observed Easter. Now, is that also not a form of Christian privilege? That whether you're a Muslim, Buddhist, secular, everybody has Easter off, whether you want it or not, right? It benefits folks like me who identify as a Christian, but not for everybody else. Should I feel guilty about that? No, right? Should I reject it and say, "I feel so bad for being a Christian," and go find a Buddhist friend and say, "I'm so sorry"? I don't think that's supposed to be the answer. There has to be another response.
This might be the same answer, but again, a common criticism of critical race theory is now not just for the white American. Now let's talk about the minority. What about how would you answer this? The risk of the minority hearing this, and they actually start to think like, "Oh, I am oppressed," or maybe I can't make it. I can't because white people are all in charge. Now I can't do it. There's something holding me back. I hear this a lot. Like if we start teaching CRT, don't make the minority think that they can't do it. We should actually empower them, and it is achievable. And then, of course, we hear all the minorities say like, look what I did. I did all this. It's not true. So how would you respond to that? There's that fear of like, we're actually making them think that they can't make it here in America.
Yeah. I would reject that one aspect of what you're saying, that the reason for our failures has nothing to do with us. So there's got to be a balance between sort of a personal responsibility, effort, and things like that, but also recognizing systems that are at play, right? Recognizing that there are systems at play. I think part of the challenge with that too is we always seem to individualize it yet again. And we say, oh, I know plenty of fill in the blank minority who's been successful, and they may not experience this. I'm going to turn the question a little bit, John, and say sometimes minorities are the ones who buy into white supremacist ideology more than even white people. And that's an assimilationist, it's a survival technique for many of us, but you don't have to be white to buy into white supremacy. It's an ideology. And I want to be very clear. We are not attacking people. We're attacking ideologies.
That's good.
And that ideology exists in me. Cornel West famously said, every day I'm trying to fight the white supremacist that lives in me. If a brilliant Black philosopher and scholar, Cornel West, can say that, we should all be able to say that. I think he recognizes that ideology is in everyone because that's the system that works in this country. If we're living in South Korea, I'm going to get Koreanized very quickly because I know that's how you're going to survive. It's not you're bilingual and you speak English better than Korean. You actually need to be part of the system where the power is, if that's what we're hungry for. And that's the system that we have here. So I think that's an important distinction. And the only other thing I want to say about that is we have to not be either or. It could be both and. Can we recognize that there are systems in play that have historically denied some groups based on race? We can recognize that those systems are still at play and also recognize individual ability and effort that are important. But having one doesn't negate the other and vice versa. It's a similar argument with predestination, right? That we say, well, if God is in control of all things, he's going to forgive me, then I'm just going to go on sinning, right? Every antinomian I know would say something like that. Of course not, right? So there's a balance between what God does in his sovereignty and providence versus my own individual responsibility and agency as a child of God.
Hey, real quick, thank you so much for watching. If you're finding value in this content, can you please support the channel by hitting the like button, subscribing, selecting all on the notification bell, or write a comment down below. All 4 of these things helps our channel get pushed out more on YouTube homepages so that more people can find this value. Okay, let's get back to the podcast. What we're doing right now, like this conversation, I think is really hard for us because our culture typically is just, don't cause problems and just follow what everyone else does. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's hard for us to talk about this stuff, but even diverse theology. But then I think it gets compounded more because in our culture, it's hierarchical. So like this, when I see you, I think immediately like, don't get Dr. Jun mad. He's older than you. He's more educated, has more experience, That's why before we started this pod, I told you, like, I hope we can still love one another because
I love that
this is not common. This is not common. But I think we both know that typically, most of the Korean American pastors and leaders still operate out of kind of our culture. And they probably wouldn't like a lot of disagreement or this type of conversation, especially because I am way younger than them. I said this in another pod, I forgot who it was with, but it's amazing that I was like in my late 30s and I'm still hearing like, you're a little bit too young, John. You got to get a little more experience, you know? And in my mind, I think I kind of have more experience than you.
Yeah.
I'm at a mega church, 8 years.
Yeah, that's right.
I know how to put together systems and structures, probably, but I can't say that because I'm Korean and because I'm young. Can't mess that respect.
That's right.
You know?
Yeah. Well, it's funny because it's not just being Korean, right? If I were to use social science language, DEI language, it's ageism, right? It's a classic example of ageism. If I were to use a biblical lens, right? It's in the Bible. This is where Timothy is told, don't be intimidated because you're young, as a young pastor, right? So even in the olden days with the Bible, we see examples of this. So the concept has been around for a long time. Koreans certainly apply it and misuse it and abuse it in ways that Americans do as well, in different ways, right? So yeah, I think we're talking about some universal concepts that get applied uniquely to different ethnic contexts and geographical contexts. So, I can always point out, again, racism, is it unique to the United States? No. My most recent book coming out is talking about global white supremacy and anti-Blackness in Brazil, in Australia, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, in Southern Africa, and of course, the United States. So it's not unique to the United States. Anti-Blackness exists in Asia. It's happening in Korea, right? And that's a whole other conversation I'd love to have with you about how what's rooted in some of what appeals to us in terms of like wanting to be more assimilating with American white culture is anti-Blackness. But these are hard conversations to have with brothers who love each other. It's certainly more difficult to have conversation with brothers and sisters who don't love each other, who don't trust each other. And we've been in our own echo chambers for so long that we show up to a discussion armed with all of the tools that we heard from CNN and all the tools that we heard from Fox News. And it's not any different than just watching a debate on television. And maybe that's why it works so effectively. Christians especially need to find ways to have these conversations, especially difficult conversations, with a posture of learning, rather than arguing to convince you that I'm right.
I think what you just said right there is something that I have been echoing a lot, which is, I don't know about your generation, but my generation, when we grew up, we never talked about politics. I don't ever remember talking about politics with my friends. Yeah. I don't remember talking about the president or about Republicans and Democrats. I think, again, going back to immigrant parents, they never voted. They didn't really care. Yeah. So we grew up, my generation grew up like that. But I think what happened in 2012 or 2016 is this guy runs for president, which we all thought like, oh, this is wild. And I think that's the first time we started to get into politics. But my theory is because we never really talked about it, I really believe most of us didn't really know much about it, like Senate, House of Representatives, how it actually works, things like that. I think what happened is that we armed ourselves with the wrong stuff. We armed ourselves with Fox, CNN, Ben Shapiro, whoever else is on YouTube, all the stuff like that. And we took all of that ammo and then we started to shoot. We started to get divided. Do you think my theory is correct?
I absolutely agree. I think children of immigrants, it's hard not to simply go along and get along because that's what we were told. You think about the generation that came before us, the folks who lived through the Japanese occupation and then lived through the Korean War and then lived through immigration. That's my parents. That's their generation, our parents and grandparents' generation, that they're still alive. And they went through at least three levels of trauma: Japanese occupation, Korean War, lost family members in both, and then came to the United States, not knowing the language or the culture, and filed for bankruptcy several times as a way of doing financing to get your kids into Harvard, and then, get these good jobs and all these kind of things. Did they ever get therapy for any of it? Right? For the immigration related stress? No. For getting, attacked in their stores? No. Did we ever get therapy for Saigu? No. Right? The riots in LA, or during the war, or during Japanese occupation. And so you carry that with you, and then you pass it on. Because if I'm of a generation where we want to talk about some of these atrocities, or they're not even atrocities, they're just, social injustices, and we take it to the generation before me, I'm like, we didn't process this stuff when we lost family members. Why are we going to process it because people are mean to you? That's how we're going to approach it.
Do you think that the stuff from the LA riots in 91 and 92, do you think that's still lingering today, that experience?
I would say it was never resolved. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, it still lingers.
I was a kid. I was in sixth grade when that happened, and I was still living here in Southern California. So, as a sixth grader, I didn't really process it. But then now that stuff is all coming back out, I started to think about it, and I was like, man, that must have been buck wild for K-Town. That was, I saw some of those pictures on the rooftops. They had like AK-47s or something. They had like these assault rifles. That must have been so buck wild. I remember someone saying that there was this picture that's being passed around. And I remember someone telling me like, I'm in that picture. I'm actually cut off. I'm right next to that guy. I was like, that's amazing. Are you serious? Like, yeah, I'm in that main picture. I just got cut off there. And so
that sounds like a line from Beef, where there's a picture of and he goes, I'm right next to this guy.
Yeah.
If they just did a wide angle, I'd have been famous. My first job in 1992 was at KYCC, Koreatown Youth and Community Center. That was my first job out of college. Graduated in 1991. The uprising was 1992. But before that, I've talked about this in other pods. It was Latasha Harlan's 13-year-old Black girl who was murdered for stealing orange juice at a Korean-owned liquor store in LA. And instead of a life sentence for murder, the perpetrator was let off, with what essentially felt like a slap on the wrist. So
Korean person?
A Korean, yeah. Who looks like my aunt and all of our aunts, and so it was heartbreaking because the tension was there. This is before Rodney King, and this is before the decision. And so the tensions were already there. So talk about the complexity or the hatred between a Black community and Asian community or Korean community. And we can disagree, but that's also a byproduct of white supremacy, of pitting one minority group against another. In whose eyes are we trying to find ourselves more appealing, right? But that's a different discussion. What were we talking about?
Talking about the LA riots and its lingering effects today. I think what you said, that it has never been resolved, and I agree with that. There's something else that happened during these past couple of years, which was all the anti-Asian hate, and because of COVID and calling it Chinese virus, and everyone thinks we're all Chinese and stuff like that. BTS maybe makes us more Korean. Now the Koreans are being recognized. Some wild stuff happening where it's violent attacks against Asians. But the thing that boils my blood, it's violent attacks against Asian grandmas and grandpas.
It's heartbreaking.
Like straight up getting punched in the face. We talked about this before, but I think she was 85 years old in New York, got lit on fire. I remember calling my parents like, Oma, Appa, do not go out at nighttime. They own a liquor store, a gas station. I was like, Appa, dude, please, like be careful, be safe. Don't go anywhere by yourself. I was telling my mom, Oma, don't go out by yourself. For me, I'm probably biased because I'm Korean, but when those stuff was happening, yeah, it got reported on the news, but I felt like it was a kind of flash in the pan.
Yeah.
And this sucks to say, and I think this is why I'm bringing it up, but this sucks to say, but I feel like if it was Black folk that this is happening to, oh my gosh, it would have swept every news channel. Everyone would be talking about. But I felt like because it was Asians, we got like our 30 minutes and that's it.
It's painful to talk about. I think for a majority of Asians growing up here in the United States, when we look at news media, we may have become very numb to Black pain. Oh, there's another shooting. There's another murder. It's caught on film. The victim is Black. The perpetrator's white. The perpetrator's Black. And maybe we just become very numb to it because we don't see Asians being victims. I don't know if you get this way, but when I hear of a shooting or some sort of violent crime, and I'm holding my breath, I'm like, please don't be Asian. Please don't be Asian. And the person is Asian, I'm filled with this collective guilt and shame. I'm just being honest. That's, what happened at Virginia Tech when they found out that the shooter was Korean, a Korean international student. My heart broke because as much as I want to celebrate Jeremy Lin and his accomplishments, I'm filled with shame and sadness and guilt when I see a mass murderer who looks like me. And I think that's part of it when we see victims in the news who look like your grandma, looks like your mom, young women in New York City and everywhere who are my daughter's age. It could be my wife, could be my sister. It's hard to stomach. It's hard to see. And I think there was an awakening because of some of the mediated responses for Asian Americans, because it was the first time we were able to see what it looked like when the victims looked like us. And that was maybe rare in the 21st century. Unfortunately, it's very common for our Black brothers and sisters who see this all the time. And I talk to some of my Black brothers and sisters and friends who say, I don't watch any of the videos. Some people say, I've never seen the Alton Sterling video. I've never seen the
George Floyd video.
I don't need to see it. I don't need to be traumatized by it. Where video exists, we don't have to watch it because it is traumatizing. And I think maybe Asian Americans now can somewhat relate with some of what our Black friends, brothers and sisters have been experiencing for a lot longer. But now it's happening to us. I would just say anti-Asian hate is not new.
Right.
That's not denying what's going on right now,
Right.
because it's coming up on media, and because of social media, it's being documented more readily.
Right.
And the news, major news networks don't know how to deal with it. But anti-Asian hate's been around. Let's say when the United States brought Chinese laborers to build the railroads, but only let the men but not the women come, because if the women came, they would be temptations as prostitutes. So that old trope has been around for a long, long time. That was in the 1800s. Anti-Asian hate happened during World War II in the United States, where they collected all the Japanese American
internment
citizens
camps.
and put them in camps. So the concept is not new. It's been around. And I think every few generations, we experience it more readily. So, but it's, I hope it doesn't lead. It's good that it leads to some activism and awareness. Again, I'm no longer surprised at the number of Asian Americans and some Asian American pastors and some Korean American pastors who are quick to argue and say, this has not been my experience. I think it's overblown.
Right.
I've never experienced it. No one in my church has experienced this. And so this is, again, the woke mob trying to tell a false story, CRT, the boogeyman, all that kind of stuff. John, part of the problem with that if I could be a little more critical of some of my friends, when we live in gated communities, in very upper class communities, not that much racism. The white and black folks who service at the country clubs are really nice to us. Our neighbors who are just like us, the top 1% in earning, are really nice to each other. So we don't experience it the same way other folks do. That has more to do with class than it does with race, but race and class do go together. But I can't imagine living in gated communities in Irvine, California, that we experience a whole lot of macroaggressions and racism. We do, but we're quick to write it off.
That makes me so upset when that happens. And it makes me even more upset when something does happen and then the response I get from my white friends is like, well, you know what? I talked to, and they all had no problem with it. And I just immediately think, wow, your whole standard was within 3 people. This is such a narrow mind on how to view bad racial or mistakes, things
It's
like
so
that.
interesting. If I wanted to monetize any of this kind of public stuff, right, the best way to do it is actually hold a very strong conservative voice, right? I think I'd be on Fox News every day. It would bring me on and say, here we have an Asian who agrees with us and goes against what everyone else has been saying, right? That was early Alex. That was the 20-year-old Alex who was assimilating and bought into everything, the American dream, and be a good old American boy and do everything that white Americans do and do it better. Right? So that ship has sailed.
Let's pivot here a little bit because we do want to talk about something really cool that just happened. There was this cool series called Beef it came out on Netflix.
Yes.
Some of our friends are in it,
Mm-hmm.
and it's starring Stephen Yeun and then Ali Wong. And there's a scene that everyone's talking about, especially the Koreans. We're all talking about this because it's a scene that all of us have experienced. We know exactly what Danny Cho is experiencing in that scene. We probably have done it ourselves.
That's right.
And it's like this emotional experience that he has during a church service. And he breaks down crying and he's there after all the stuff that he's done. Did you watch the whole thing?
Yeah.
Yeah, dude, I binged it. I was up until like 4 a.m. I was on episode 7. I was like, okay, I got to go to sleep now. My wife was so mad at me. I was like, she wasn't mad actually, but she was like, I can't believe you stayed up that long. Finished it the next day. When you saw that scene, what were some of your emotions that came up when you saw that scene?
What's interesting, John, is my first thought was this incredible exposure. I felt so vulnerable in that moment because I felt like I was watching a home video. You know what I mean? I'm like, hey, I know that it was Citizen Church and the praise team. It could have very well been my own church, right? And they could have filmed it anywhere because it was so accurate. It was so spot on. Beef, if I could be critical a little bit, the premise of the show is kind of silly. That's the part that I don't enjoy. The other parts, the ancillary parts of the show with like genuine Korean American culture, I thought was pretty good. Except for this one restaurant scene where the guy's yelling "agashi" to an ajima.
That was weird when he said "agashi."
Bro, you got your no.
They would get mad if she said "agashi." I said that to my hand right away. My wife,
right?
Like, that was weird. He said "agashi."
Ajima at best.
"Agashi."
Yeah. So that was a funny, but what a great space to be able to be that specific with our critiques.
Yeah, right.
Because usually you get it all wrong. I mean, I grew up in the era of All American Girl with Margaret Cho.
I was going to talk about that.
It was horrible. Yep. And I loved it because it's the closest thing I've ever seen that someone who looks like us. Mm-hmm. I was thinking about Short Round. I grew up with Short Round. And when I was a teenager, and now my children, my boys who are teenagers, they get an Academy Award-winning performance. What a difference in the experiences. Same actor, different results. But I loved Beef in that sense, the premise of how can one person have at the same time road rage, revenge, and then tears singing praise songs at church? I'm like, that's me. And that's everyone else I know. I think in that sense, it really captures the totality and the range of what exists in sort of the human spirit. So that was a powerful moment. I really enjoyed it. And I love the authenticity of it. And I wish we could see more, right? So folks who aren't Korean and didn't grow up in a Korean American church are thinking, well, how genuine was that? Listen to what everybody is saying who's had that experience. You're like, this is pretty authentic. It is pretty authentic. Down to the real praise band leading it, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, I thought Jason just did a interview with Christianity Today, an article about it. And he actually said like, yeah, I was actually there. And one of the things I really wanted to make sure is that they weren't going to make this like a caricature of a creature. We wanted to be as real as possible. Yeah. And he was very thankful because like his best friend was, I think, the director, producer of it. And so he was there to make sure it was as real as possible. And I think it totally was. From the moment he steps in, like again, like 80s church, it's like one room, right? I bet you it was a community center that they rented. I started laughing as soon as he walked in and, hey, I'm Pastor Kim.
That's right.
I'm Pastor Kim. I was laughing. I was like, oh my gosh, this is so
Would you like to fill out a newcomer's card?
Oh my gosh, fill this out.
We do that.
So spot on. Just the way that guy who was playing the pastor was talking. Yeah, thank you so much. Just like soft tone.
Spot
on. Spot on.
A little too close to home.
You're right.
It was very real.
You know, some of the I agree with you that the Korean culture that was represented in there, though, felt so real to me. I resonated a lot with his need to help his parents.
Oh, yeah.
And when he was talking to his parents, it was so emotional for me because I felt in my own life when I felt so guilty that I couldn't take care of them. Yeah. I'm the younger son, so I have an older brother. But then I was the son that went to USC. I did well in academics. And I remember my mom telling me one day, like, you know, you got to start supporting us. And I started crying because I didn't have the job that I needed to have to do that. Right. So him talking to his parents felt so real to me. But even when his mom and dad were talking back, it's so real, you know? Yeah. Did you eat? Yeah. Are you taken care of? I think his name was Paul, right? Are you taking care of?
His younger brother.
All of that.
All of it
was so emotional for me, that family makeup.
Yeah. His need to buy property, right? To take care of his parents. You know, it was the ultimate symbol of the American dream to be able to buy land and buy a home for your parents. You know, it's so deeply personal as I think about that part of the story. And I think they captured it well. I joked and said, I don't think this was this was a docuseries.
Yeah, right.
It was a documentary of Korean American Christians in some ways. Yeah, it was powerful.
Even that scene, do you have siblings?
I do. I have one older sister.
Okay, so I have an older brother. So I think it resonated with me more where, you know, Danny and Fall, the characters were at odds at all times. But there was that scene where they started playing Nerf basketball together. I resonated that so much. That's me, my brother and I always at odds. But then all of a sudden you can just have fun. And then they're just playing together. That, again, felt so real to me.
Yeah, for me, I have 3 children, but 2 boys, a daughter and 2 sons. And it's resonated as a parent to see, my goodness, they'll just fight and argue and then play so well together. And it's really well done. I found myself laughing and cringing and crying, you know, all in the same episode. Really interesting. But I think my takeaway from all of this is we need more of these.
For sure.
I hope this is not the one and done. You know, next time they do it, they'll get the ajumma and the agashi corrected. You know, there's a bunch of other stuff that I think it's an opportunity to have even more of these stories being told. And more complexity, I think, is beautiful.
Right.
And it's stories that need to be told. You know, I love Blackpink and BTS. I mean, there's a generation I am way past. I was K-pop before K-pop was cool, right? This is the 90s, right? I was a part of the generation of Lee Moon-se and Lee Sung-chul and some of the oldies. Yeah, I could tell by the look on your face.
I was going to say,
these old.
You were kind of Kim Go-mo era, right?
A little bit after my time, but yeah, late 90s.
Yeah.
I was late 80s.
Before like Solid K-pop. And all these guys.
Yeah. They were babies when I was listening. Yeah. So.
Yeah.
Classic. But anyway, it was never cool. Right? Listening to
embarrassing.
Yeah.
My brother would pump that. I was embarrassed.
Yeah.
I was like, dude, please. It's like Lula and stuff like that. It's embarrassed. Like, but and now
today, everyone's listening to it. And there's something beautiful about it, even if I don't appreciate the music.
I was gonna say that Beef to me, because we joked about this before, was way more relatable than Crazy Rich Asians because, like you said, that's the top 1%, it does exist.
Yeah.
Most of us, that's not us. That's not us.
That's right.
So, of course, Beef was Korean culture too. So then, it was relatable to us culturally. Yeah. But I even make a comparison. I don't know if you ever saw this movie on Netflix, but it was called The Wish Dragon.
No.
The Wish Dragon, Wong Fu Productions, I forgot his name, but he's one of the voices in it.
Okay.
Wish Dragon came out on Netflix the same time Raya and the Last Dragon came out on Disney+.
Oh, is that right?
Raya and the Last Dragon was cool because whoa, Asian character, this is great. But it was a little bit more fantasy because a dragon talking to a dragon, stuff like that. For me, Wish Dragon was the movie. That's I love that movie. That's my favorite because way more real. It was about a Chinese guy growing up. The culture and the reality of it, you could just relate to it so much more. And just, again, the lessons that they're trying to teach, that is us. That was us. Raya was fantasy and it was Disney. It was, as Disney. But for me, Wish Dragon was the movie that I loved. I loved that movie.
For me, it was, now I'm dating myself, but it was Better Luck Tomorrow.
I remember that. I remember that.
Very much a docuseries, right? Because it was based on true story of some of the atrocities that happened in Fullerton. But again, it's depending on whose eyes you're trying to, meet and whose approval you're trying to earn. And I think Hollywood is changing where you can have these stories. And right now it's hot. We'll see how long this trends. But right now, being as authentic as you can in Asian American spaces, Korean American spaces, seems to be popular. I'm a student of history, so I know nothing lasts forever. So enjoy it while we can, because then we're going to move on to another flavor of the month. That may be the reality. But some of this stuff may stay forever. And hopefully the good parts will stay forever. And we can embrace something like Beef for what it is. And hopefully that sets up an opportunity for a whole other generation of young folks who are inspired by this to say, I could do another one. I could do a better one. And that's our hope.
There's a character in Beef that actually, to me, almost even sticks out a little bit more than Stephen Yeun's character, because maybe because I'm a pastor, but it was the character that Jason Min played.
Yeah, the fake pastor.
This faker. And my blood is boiling because I was like, we know them.
Yeah.
We know those fakers. These guys played the Christian card.
Oh, yeah.
But man, that basketball scene, I was laughing so hard. I was like, oh my gosh, that's real. Like we played basketball, we're like, whoa, like what's going on? Why are you acting like that?
That's right.
That character to me actually also spot on.
Yeah.
These guys who come to Korean church, put on all the right clothes and lead worship. But we all know that these guys, man, this guy's a faker, but the pastor doesn't know, and like the head leaders know, and they continue to serve.
Back in the day, we called that church game. Like you had mad church game.
Yeah.
Right. Play the right role, lead praise. My goodness. Yeah. It was so funny. But I think it captures really pretty accurately the complexity of our identities, right? That we can be church boy, and we can be all the other things and fakers. And I'm like, well, that's all of us, right? Like I said before, we can have road rage and then come to church and praise the Lord, right? All on the same day. In fact, road rage happen on our way to church. And it's really fun if it happened to someone against someone in church. That would be really interesting. But anyway, I think it captures pretty accurately the complexity of human character.
Yeah.
Our sinfulness, but we're saved by grace. I don't know. I thought it was great. I wish the storyline would be more along those lines and talk about a fun documentary of Korean American church culture. That'd be worth doing.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Especially Korean church.
Yeah.
That
Korean
would be
church especially
very
would be
fun
really good
to see.
That's right.
Watch.
That's right. Yeah.
We're talking about church and beef and that setting. And this kind of goes back to what we talked about with CRT and everything. Do you think that the white American church in America is ready to have an Asian lead pastor?
No.
Why do you say that?
Part of the challenge is that we place too much emphasis on one individual, that we celebrate a little too much if we say, if you're a large white church, to say, we have an Asian pastor, we have a Korean pastor. I think that's true for other minorities too. If you're in that position, as my friend Owen Lee likes to say, he said, well, then you made it to the NBA, right? You are the ultimate success story because an Asian was able to lead white people or an Asian was able to lead non-white people. I think what we fail to recognize is how lonely that can be for folks who are in these leadership positions. I'm friends with several folks who are Asian, Korean American, who are leading large, mostly white ministries.
Like Ryan Kwan. Is Ryan Kwan your friend?
I know of Ryan.
Know of him. Okay.
Yes.
But people like him. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, how did they do it then?
About.
How did they become the lead pastor? There's a very few of them, and that's why we know them.
Yeah.
Because there's very few.
Yeah.
How did these 6 guys do it? How do you think it happened?
Well, I think there's a part of the giftedness and the accomplishments of any of these folks who happen to be Asian American, and organizations and ministries recognize them for people who are genuinely gifted in what they're able to do. But, it's a lot of code shifting. There's a lot of code shifting that has to happen in those spaces. The other challenge is, are they able to be, and I don't know. And so it'd be worth inviting all of these folks in and have them have conversations. But can you be your authentic self? Is it a compliment? I'll ask this question, hypothetical question. Is it a compliment if you have an Asian leader of a ministry and they say, I don't see that person as Asian at all? I don't think that's a compliment. Maybe a generation ago, I thought that was a compliment. Alex, I don't see you as Korean. I just assume that you're white. Well, thank you, because that's what I've been working toward all these years. Oh, that was what I longed to hear. All my assimilationist efforts came to, fruition. Now I realize, why would that be a compliment? In whose eyes is that a compliment? And so I wonder in these spaces, how many folks have to actually play a role, or it's so deeply embedded that becomes their norm. And so what does that do for them? What does that do for their family members? That's something to consider. And if you have one senior pastor or president in this role and you invite a VP or an associate pastor who also happens to be Asian American, right? What do you think the response will be? Oh, that's wonderful. We're so glad that we have more Asian Americans in leadership positions. I don't think so. The response will be, well, are you being fair in selecting the next lieutenant for this role? I don't know if you should hire another one, right? Because there can only be one. I mean, that's the dilemma growing up is if I had all my non-Asian friends, I had all my white friends, and I saw another Asian dude who was hanging around his group of white friends, we'd look at each other and we'd size each other up and we're like, there can't be 2 of us in this space. We can only have one Asian sidekick. You're messing my game up, man, right? And so I wonder how much of that is just part of a dominant system and a narrative.
Yeah.
And I think people in those leadership positions also have a burden. They probably don't say it very often, but they're like, well, I can't hire another Korean American to be my number 2 because everyone will say, oh, now you're only hiring Koreans. Never mind the fact that for the last 50 years of the organization, one white man hired another white man and hired another white man, and nobody said boo. And all of a sudden, you get one Asian American in leadership who invites another Asian American in leadership, and all of a sudden, it's favoritism and nepotism. That's the problem. In the long run, that'll be the problem. And so we celebrate it. We have our Obama moments, and we celebrate one token Asian in a leadership role that has never been non-white. And then nothing left but problems. Maybe I'm being overly cynical, but I think that's part of the challenge.
Good points there. Here at the seminary, I am putting together an English-speaking M.Div program. That's what we're doing here. And the whole goal here is to have English-speaking Korean American students. The seminary is already Korean-speaking seminary students, but this English program is going to be very, very focused on Korean culture, trying to understand how to do ministry with what's normally in a Korean church, right? Like this duplex model, first gen, second gen, Korean speaking, EM, KM, all that stuff. Yeah. So we're trying to make a dent in this 40-year battle of division and just like, they don't get us. So while they train theologically and biblically, we're going to really try to help them like, well, how do you understand this culture?
That's great.
So one of our kind of values here, we're going to train you to be a missionary first and then be a pastor. How do you shepherd a culture that you don't understand, right? When you hear all that, and I know that in your experience at Full Gospel, it was really good, but I'm sure you have a lot of Korean friends who have experienced just hardship and stuff in the first, second gen kind of a model. I know your church is very different too, because you guys are autonomous of me on the same campus, and you have a very good relationship with KM. When you hear this vision, what do you think needs to be taught or be accomplished in order to create that healthier bridge between Korean speaking first gen and then English speaking second, third gen Korean Americans?
First of all, I think it's incredibly encouraging that you're taking this on and that the seminary sees the need for this. And I think we automatically make the wrong assumption that either Korean means Korean language and culture, or Korean American simply means American, which may mean white and fully assimilated. So being able to recognize this third space, which is second and third generation Asian American, second and third generation Korean Americans, and making sure that it's contextualized. We can make some assumptions, right? That second and third generation Korean Americans may be very familiar with American culture and English, but also still identify with their heritage culture, even if they don't speak Korean. Or maybe I shouldn't make that assumption. Maybe more and more third generation folks are starting to actually speak the language as well. So it'll be interesting contextualization. The other part, I think the challenge, if you're going to bring Korean speaking, Korean culture folks and English speaking Korean Americans together, a lot of this may be what some people will refer to as family therapy. You need to have these conversations and recognize and put on the table the hurts and the misunderstandings and the lack of trust that has formed over the years. I'm trying not to use language like first generation, second generation, because I look at Koreanized, Korean-speaking pastors leading KMs, they're all younger than me. That just says I'm an old man, but the fact that they're my age or younger and everyone else is dead or retired says something about the shift in Korean language ministries. I think a healthy contextual approach to what is uniquely Korean American should be addressed. And it may not be forever, but for this season, for such a time as this, I think it's very important that we address it. Most of the work that I'm engaged in terms of ministry for my denomination is the Korean American Leadership Initiative, CALI. And we exist primarily for English-speaking Korean American pastors and leaders who find themselves in these very liminal spaces. I was watching this nature show, something on YouTube, where this poor fish, this school of fish, were being chased by bigger fish underwater. And so they would rise to the surface to try to get away because the big fish were chasing them. And then when they jumped out and breached the water and they reached the surface level, birds would come down and chase them. And it was the scene with dramatic music and these poor fish. I don't remember what kind of fish they were, but they were being chased underwater and then they were chased above water. And it was a survival. And that was an imagery I thought of Korean Americans in ministry. You're kind of working your way through some of the cultural baggage that happened with Korean speaking, Korean culture, first gen pastors. You thought maybe I'll make it in a quote unquote real church, a white church, a right church. And you realize you don't belong there either. And so somewhere between being chased by bigger predators in the water and chased by predators above the water is where we live. And being able to address that liminal space and recognizing it and naming it, I think is a big part of the ministry. So I'm so glad you're doing it.
That's great. Yeah, I actually talked about that in a class that we teach, that I don't really believe that anyone has ever really helped us unpack what Korean American means. I think most of us just did the model minority myth.
That's right.
And then now that my generation, we all have kids now, we have families, we're really wrestling it as parents.
Yeah.
And I think it's all coming out. So I totally agree with that.
Yeah.
I think we got to really unpack a Korean American identity. What does that mean?
Yeah. And it's interesting because if you think about the history of the church, when some of my Dutch friends will say, or other European Americans who are fourth, fifth generation would just say, yes, the immigrant German church or the immigrant Dutch church started this way. And they went from, I guess you would call it the DM, Dutch ministry, and EM. And so there was a generation where it was thriving in whatever heritage language they were, German or Dutch or what have you. And then over time, they just got older. And so then services became more in English. And then they were non-Dutch. And now they're just like regular American Christian churches. Or are they? They're still Dutch, right? Did they really just simply assimilate and disappear? I think about the Christian Reformed Church, right? The CRC. It was a Dutch congregation. So the whole denomination is rooted in ethnic specific theology, which is interesting to me. But my point is, what will happen to Korean Americans or Asian Americans? Will we have the same experience as the Dutch after 3 or 4 generations of Korean Americans who speak English only? Will we simply merge into American society like the Dutch did? No. Well, why not? What fundamentally is different about Dutch and Koreans? We don't look the same. And so we run up against this same issue. Japanese Americans who've had a longer history of immigration, Chinese Americans who have a longer history, not necessarily talking about the church, but just immigration history. How well have they integrated and assimilated and became fully American? And that's something for us to see. We learn from history to predict potentially what's going to happen in the future for us. What's more scary is if we fail to learn from history, we're bound to repeat the same mistakes.
Some really good thoughts there. Really good thoughts. You got 3 kids. Your daughter has been blessed by going to the greatest school. She's also a Trojan. She's a freshman right now?
No, she's about to graduate.
Wow, it's been that long.
She's finishing her bachelor's and she's picked up a master's degree at the same time.
What is she? What's her focus? What's her study?
She's studying gerontology.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, which is very appropriate. She has a heart for missions. She would love to do medical missions someday. We'll see what she ends up doing.
Wow.
But very encouraged. She's very involved in Christian a cappella band.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. Overflow.
Okay.
She's loved it. She's had a lot of fun with it. She's almost done. She graduates in May.
Oh my goodness. I feel like I remember that post where you were like loading up your car, helping her move. I feel like that just happened.
Well, the pandemic took 2.5 years of our lives.
I know, that's what it was, right?
Where time stood still. So she had her first year, actually just her first semester.
Yeah, and then shut down.
The pandemic.
Yeah.
And then she went back, I think, for her junior. Yeah, so lost a year and a half, 2 years.
Man.
So she graduates in May.
Wow.
Yeah, second generation Trojan.
Now she got to pay you guys back, take care of you, right? 엄마 나빠진 용돈, dude.
That's right. Maybe she should have gone to medical school to pay off the bills.
And then you got 2 boys. Are they both in high school right now?
My son Isaiah is a first year. He's at Azusa Pacific University with me.
Okay.
And then Jeremiah is a junior.
Oh, so he's taking SATs right now and all that stuff. Okay.
He did all that. So
and applying next year.
Yeah.
Does he know where he wants to go? Does he have ideas?
I'm pretty much sure they want to stay local. All my kids want to stay local, which is good.
That's what I want with my kids. Just stay around here.
You know, being a Korean American, second generation Korean father, it's hard. You still fight like crazy. All the idolatries that exist in terms of education and status and all those things. And so, you know, trying to work it through with my children as I work it through myself of some of these idolatries. So it's an ongoing battle.
That's great.
Yeah.
Man, well, someday I got to get your wife on here, the other Dr. Jun.
Yeah,
that would be a fun conversation.
She'd be a lot more interesting than me. Sure.
I just uploaded the podcast with Jen Shin last week. And then Jen, I didn't know Jen and your wife were close friends. I didn't know that.
It's wild, right? This is like old school KCM, like all the short-term missions back in the 80s and 90s. We all knew each other.
That's
the next time we'll get together, we'll say who dated who. That'll be a fun conversation that should never be public.
Well, man, thank you so much for your time. I always say this every time I see you. I love spending time with you. There's so much I can learn from you. And it's always fun because I feel like we think on the same wavelength, but you're just so much smarter than me. And so I just kind of like glean all this wisdom. So thanks for being here.
Okay, I'll buy lunch. Could I? Okay. Thanks, John. I love what you do here, man. It's so good. I really appreciate all you're doing.